Secretary Scott Bessent as he thinks about going to multilateral meetings. These will strengthen the hand of our hopefully soon to be confirmed colleague at the United Nations. So we're here on the House floor today to talk about how we can strengthen American leadership across the globe. And one way to do that is to counter China's attempt to manipulate world's rules. And so I want to thank my friend from Pennsylvania for sponsoring this bill. I yield him 3 minutes to describe its benefit. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my very good friend, Chairman Hill, for his leadership, and I rise in support of my legislation, the China Exchange Rate Transparency Act, H.R. 692, a bipartisan bill supported by my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. This legislation directly confronts the People's Republic of China's very nebulous, opaque, and often manipulative practices in foreign exchange markets, including their policy of intentionally depreciating their own currency, which undercuts the competitiveness of U.S. exports in a random manner that's targeted based upon products and particular industries. By mandating the U.S. Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund to use the voice and vote of the United States to advocate for increased exchange rate transparency from China, we're not just advocating for fairness, we're fighting for the integrity of the global economy in line with our own international trade goals. It's very reasonable. During Treasury Secretary Bessent's nomination hearing, he explained that the United States can leverage foreign exchange rates to make U.S. exports more competitive. However, achieving this will require every country to abide by the same exchange rate standards. It's time we, in fact, confront China's persistent gaming of international norms. They've been playing by their own rules for too long, and it's detrimental to global economic fairness and stability. This legislation is not about singling out China. It's about ensuring that all IMF members, including China, adhere to the rules they agreed to. China promised to maintain orderly exchange rate arrangements without manipulation. It's our job to hold them to that promise to ensure they do not continue to exploit the system to their advantage. We are taking a firm, no-nonsense approach to a complex issue, emphasizing our commitment to fair trade and transparent economic system. I strongly urge my colleagues to support the China Exchange Rate Transparency Act, H.R. 692, which did pass overwhelmingly last Congress by a vote of 379 to 1. This legislation is a stand for accountability in international finance, fair trade practices, and the stability of the global economy. It is very important. And now, with the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, this will be an added tool for somebody strong and tough like he to utilize to create this economic trade stability and fairness, particularly with China. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to close if the gentleman from Arkansas has no further speakers.
I'd tell Mr. Speaker, I say to the gentleman that I have one more speaker.
The gentleman reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I yield 2 minutes for one of the newest members on the House Financial Services Committee, the committee whip, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Herodopoulos, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a new member of Congress, I'm honored to be on the floor today to support this good bill. For decades, it's been suspected that China manipulates its exchange rate to keep the dollar value of their currency artificially low. Why do they do this? To simply manipulate the market, to encourage exports and discourage imports, tipping the scales in their favor. That is not free trade, nor is it fair trade. Even the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund both prohibit the use of currency manipulation to gain trade advantages. However, like so many other issues, the Chinese Communist Party's lack of transparency on this issue has been a roadblock to taking action to end this unfair practice. So let's bring their trade practices into the sunlight. This brilliant bill by my colleague from Pennsylvania, who chairs the Financial Services Oversight and Investigations Committee, will require Treasury to push IMF members to take China's lack of transparency into account when considering China's shareholding at the fund. I urge my colleagues to support this good bill as a step forward towards fairer trade with the communist dictatorship. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from
Mr.
Arkansas
Speaker,
is recognized.
we don't have additional speakers, and so I reserve and I yield to my friend, Mr. Vargas.
Gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am prepared then to close. And I yield myself the balance of the time. China
Gentleman is
has been
recognized.
accused of manipulating its currency to expand both its economy and global influence. Concerns about this include its effects on American interests at international institutions like the International Monetary Fund. This bill proposes a way to address that, and I support it. I reiterate my concerns, however, to do so in the light of Trump's effort to defy law, Congress, and the Constitution by ending our foreign aid programs, withdrawing from global institutions, and attacking our allies as folly. In order to actually stand against Chinese aggression, one must stand up against our own president's aggression and his malign policies. Again, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I want to thank Mr. Muser for his hard work on this bill, and to friends on both sides of the aisle, these are both significant reform efforts in the IMF to improve transparency, and particularly for what we've seen over the years as a lack of being willing to play by the multilateral rules that all large developed economies have been doing. And so I really support these bills, and I urge colleagues to support H.R. 692, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 692 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
And the nays.
Opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative. For what purposes, the gentleman from Arkansas?
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 736, the Protect Small Businesses from Excessive Paperwork Act of 2025.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 736, a bill to amend Title 31 United States Code to modify the deadline for filing beneficial ownership information reports for reporting companies formed or registered before January 1, 2024.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 736, the Protect Small Business from Excessive Paperwork Act. I want to start by thanking Representative Nunn of Iowa for his work on this important legislation. In 2021, Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act, known as the CTA. The goal of the CTA was to strengthen national security tools to target bad actors and nation states attempting to launder money through illicit activities. To accomplish this, the CTA established the Beneficial Ownership Information Reporting Regime through Treasury's Bureau, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, known across the country as FinCEN. With an effective date of January 1st, 2024, the CTA regulations required roughly 32,600,000 small businesses in the United States report their beneficial ownership information to FinCEN by the following year. To the best of my knowledge, Mr. Speaker, only some 9 million, or 1/3 of those required small businesses, have filed. Recent federal court actions on this confusing and complex rule have just added to the confusion that many of our members are hearing about from their constituents in their districts. Although this law was enacted with good intentions, Treasury's promulgation and implementation of the new reporting regime has been overly complex and particularly burdensome. Over the last year, members have heard consistently from their constituents that confusion reigns when it comes to beneficial ownership reporting requirements. And we've all heard not only from small businesses that are in the real estate business or in some small operating business that have a limited liability company or a limited partnership, but we've heard from their CPAs, their certified public accountants. We've heard from their legal advisors, all about the confusion and concern around these reporting requirements. It does not help that many small businesses have no idea what FinCEN is, making them wary of submitting such sensitive data to a government agency with which they're not familiar, personally identifiable information. The most sensitive information we have, our name, our taxpayer ID number, our ownership of our companies. And that's why Congressman Nunn's bill provides a 1-year extension of the reporting deadline, which will allow FinCEN to address gaps in its nationwide education campaign and tailor its outreach to small business owners. This extension ensures that all small business owners that qualify and are required as beneficial owners have adequate time to try to complete their reporting requirements. While here in Congress, we continue to fight back against this particular rule and its structure. Otherwise, Mr. Speaker, these small business owners face aggressive penalties if they fail to report, even if it's unintentional. Small businesses in this country are the backbone of our economy. I hear it said many times every week on this House floor. And if that's true, we ought to be working together and get relief to them from this onerous rule. I commend Mr. Nunn for offering the relief with his particular legislation. I want to highlight the work of my Republican colleagues for their co-sponsorship of this critical legislation, and thank my friends on the other side of the aisle, the gentlelady from Kansas, Ms. Davids, Mr. Davis of North Carolina, for signing on to H.R. 736. I hope they will help us get this legislation over the finish line and benefit America's small businesses, even if it's in a moment of reprieve from the avalanche of rules. I urge all my colleagues to join me in supporting Mr. Nunn's bill, H.R. 736, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Despite the ill-named bill, I rise in support of H.R. 736, the Protect Small Businesses from Excessive Paperwork Act, sponsored by Representative Nunn. This bill extends the deadline for existing reporting companies under the Corporate Transparency Act, an essential piece of national security legislation designed to help law enforcement, financial institutions, and others root out the anonymous shell companies that are so often abused by domestic and foreign oligarchs, drug dealers, and terrorists to launder and hide their illicit funds. Extending the reporting deadline gives businesses extra time to comply with the law and additional time for the U.S. Treasury to do vital outreach needed to raise awareness among applicable business owners. I appreciate that Representative Nunn and Chairman Hill have chosen to offer this bill on the floor today, especially given the broad support for issuing this extension within our committee. But I have to say, given where things stand with the Trump administration, these concerns fall a little flat. Since the inauguration, President Trump has disbanded the Klepto-Capture Task Force designed to identify and pursue illicit Russian funds. He has declared that he will no longer prosecute most foreign corruption cases. President Trump has fired hundreds of bank examiners who are responsible for ensuring that financial institutions are keeping up with their obligations to detect and report possible instances of financial crime. He shuttered the Consumer Protection Bureau, which has returned $21 billion to defrauded Americans. Further, he and his GOP have fired criminal investigators at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service and prosecutors at the Department of Justice. And he has himself offered cryptocurrency products that can be purchased without any verifiable identification, undercutting the very financial crime-fighting agencies that the CTA intends to bolster. So yes, I urge members to vote for this bill. It's got little meaning if my GOP colleagues remain silent as President Trump dismantles the national security law and enforcement capacity of the U.S. government. Also, it's ironic that I hear my good friend from Arkansas talk about the most sensitive, vital information that we have, our personal identifiable information, and at this moment we don't even know who has access to it. That's one of the things that angers most Americans. They don't know what Elon Musk is doing with this information or what young kid is running through these organizations getting that information and for what purpose they're using it. So yes, Rome is burning, and my colleagues across the aisle need to stop fiddling and pick up the fire extinguisher. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Yield 4 minutes to the gentleman who's crafted this constructive bill, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, the lead sponsor.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to my colleagues from both Arkansas and California for your support of this bill. My bill, the Protect Small Businesses from Excessive Paperwork Act. Mr. Speaker, in just the opening weeks of Congress, we have already led on bipartisan solutions to help our small businesses be successful and get reprieve from the vast overreach that currently emanates from Washington, D.C. Small businesses, as we've noted, are the backbone of America. And in my home state, it makes up nearly 80% of our state's growth alone. Sadly, there are bureaucrats here in Washington who are focused on fines, fees, and prison time for nearly 32 million small businesses who only woke up to new regulations just showing up on the scene. And unfortunately, nearly 23 million of those small businesses have never even heard or received information about the new requirements that they must meet. In fact, some even mistook them for scams coming out of a federal agency they've never even heard of. Small businesses should not bear the risk of fines of up to $600 per fine, per infraction, per day for every violation, and up to nearly 24 months in prison for failure to report on a law they weren't even familiar with. In the first year alone, it will cost a small business around $8,000 in compliance fees. That blows my mind. In fact, it compelled me to invite the director under the Biden administration of FinCEN, Director Gackey, to come to Iowa. And yes, we were Iowa nice to her, but we were Iowa firm. When she spoke to Iowa, when she heard from Sunrisers Popcorn and Bergman Electric and Berg Electric, who told her how much these new requirements would directly impact their Main Street business. And to make matters worse, she told them with a straight face that she'd informed over 7 million businesses and that they'd already complied. This was with only weeks before final implementation went into effect. To be clear, this meant that around 80% of the small businesses remained unaware completely of the new rules and regulations and risked those fines I mentioned. With 99% of Iowa's businesses being those small businesses, those fines would add up and shutter main streets across my community and across this country. Our regulators would total around $160 billion in compliance costs levied upon Main Street businesses, small family farms, and communities across our country. I think we can all agree that regulators should be focused on protecting small businesses, not fining them out of existence. By keeping a small business open, it requires that a mom and pop shop put a lot of hard work and long hours in. It means that new entrepreneurs can be innovative and spend money growing our economy, not trying to meet some arbitrary government regulation. And it should not stifle those with a heavy hand when they're only doing their best to serve our communities. That's why I'm committed to fighting for Main Street. I'm committed for fighting for our family farms. I'm committed to fighting for our hometowns. And this bill will help protect small businesses from excessive paperwork. This is a simple solution that we've worked on together, and it's one of the most pressing concerns small businesses face. So whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, we all have small businesses and a hometown responsibility to fight for them today. And I'm grateful for everyone who helped lead and sponsor this bill, including the National Small Business Association, the U.S. Chambers of Commerce, our national cattlemen, even cowboys want less regulation. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors on this bill, including our co-leads, the House Majority Whip Tom Emmer, and my friends across the aisle, Representative Sharice Davis and Representative Don Davis. As a result, we have the opportunity to once again make sure that not only America is great, but that our hometowns have the opportunity to prosper and hold Washington accountable. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield my time. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I
Gentleman yields.
reserve.
I'm sorry. The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers. I'm prepared to close if the gentleman from Arkansas has no further speakers.
Mr. Speaker, I have several other speakers on this matter, so I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes from the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I once again thank Chairman Hill for his leadership. I do as well rise today in strong support of the Protect Small Business from Excessive Paperwork Act 736, introduced by my colleague, Congressman Nunn. Small businesses create jobs, drive innovation, support local communities, really make the difference in communities. Unfortunately, we have the previous administration imposed many, many duplicative and costly regulations on small businesses simply to make it harder for them to survive. One of the latest and most egregious examples was FinCEN's beneficial ownership information reporting rule, which we're all very aware of at this point. This rule literally forces millions of small businesses that have less than 20 employees and under $5 million in revenue to file redundant, intrusive, unnecessary reports to the federal government under the threat of very steep penalties, up to $10,000. H.R. 736 rightfully delays the beneficial ownership reporting rule 1 year to 2026, giving the Trump administration and the courts time to assess the proper path forward for small businesses. So actually, this reporting information can provide some usefulness as opposed to just a great burden. Republicans received a mandate to cut the red tape and push back against unnecessary punitive regulations, and we're going to do it that do more harm than good. I, again, thank Chairman Hill and Representative Nunn for prioritizing this much-needed relief for small businesses. Small businesses need our support, not our red tape and bureaucratic demands for unnecessary, nonsensical information. So I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that you note the comment made by Mr. Muser on the subject of 20 employees or $5 million. So the definition of this bill says that a small business that has to report these 32 million plus businesses that we're talking about, the definition is they have fewer than 20 employees and fewer than $5 million. And my friend from California rightfully said that the concern of the federal government is about illicit finance through the use of shell companies incorporated in one of our states. But let that sink in to everybody listening to this debate. $5 million in revenues, 20 employees. Mr. Speaker, for decades before I came to Congress a few years ago, I helped start businesses, I helped finance businesses, all of which would dream to have $5 million in annual revenues and 20 employees. Think about your best friend who has a HVAC contracting company to help people with their air conditioning and heating. He works there. His son works for him. They have a couple $1 million in revenue. It's his whole livelihood. He loves it. He's the best at what he does. But in this world, in this house, he's accused of being a shell company and being burdened by this rule. So once again, so many times the government goes after the bad guy and sweeps up everybody. And that's why Mr. Nunn has come to this floor to say, we need another year to think about this, and I would certainly urge the incoming administration to rethink the whole process. Because Mr. Vargas is right, it's an important thing to do to try to capture illicit finance, but it's another thing in the world to sweep up every American trying to live the American dream with their own small business. We want people who want $5 million in revenue and have 20 employees. What a joy. So we're united on this today, Mr. Speaker, and I think that's good for the American people to see too, that we care about what's happening, and occasionally we get it wrong in government and we work hard to try to rectify it. And that's what Zach Nunn of Iowa is fighting for small businesses to do. And I yield 2 minutes for my friend, the committee whip, Mr. Haroldopoulos from Florida, in support of this legislation.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the chairman for bringing this to the floor and our colleagues across the aisle for working together on this important bill. It is great that common sense is making a comeback in America. I really applaud the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Nunn from Iowa. He's done a remarkable job of bringing this to the forefront as people recognize the impact that burdensome paperwork can have on our American economy. In recent years, the previous administration imposed complex, costly beneficial ownership requirements backed by the of civil and criminal penalties. Compliance could cost up to $8,000 per year, and little was done by the Treasury Department to communicate those requirements to business owners. As a result, with little clarity and even less time to comply, over 30 million small businesses are now facing the risk of thousands of dollars in fines and potentially years behind bars if egregious. Why are we making such criminal suspects out of small business owners? American businesses already file a considerable amount of paperwork to ensure that money laundering and bad actors are unable to operate through shell corporations, as the chairman highlighted. Why are millions of American small businesses now forced to file these regulations when they already been burdened by so much extra paperwork? With the extension, this will also give our new Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Bessent, the time to apply common sense in helping small businesses meet these reporting requirements. This bill is a strong start to reduce the immense regulatory burden that America's small businesses face each day and protect business owners from unjust criminal liability. Let's pass this bill and get back to common sense. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and I thank you for your leadership.
I thank the gentleman for Florida yielding back. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to close it. The gentleman.
I yield to my friend from Florida.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I yield myself the balance of the time. The Corporate Transparency Act has been called the most important improvement to the U.S. anti-money laundering framework in a generation. To both effectively enact the law and to assist companies whose reporting is essential to fight against oligarchs and criminal cartels, we need the extension provided by this bill. As my good friend from Arkansas has said, we too see and hear small businesses and business owners. In fact, California has the largest number of small businesses in the United States. We don't want them to get swept up in this bill, I should say in the Corporate Transparency Act, but at the same time, we also need the ability to identify, investigate, and prosecute the bad actors. So I urge all my colleagues to stand up and speak out against what we're seeing today, unfortunately, which is President Trump's vengeful and self-interested destruction of our American national security, and to demand that we get information on how Elon Musk and his young marauders are using Americans' personal information. We want to know, what are they doing with all this information that they're gathering about all these Americans? What is he doing with it? We have no idea, and no one's asking questions on the other side. Again, it's important. If you listen to your constituents right now, on both sides of the aisle. Both, I know in my district, Republicans and Democrats, they want to know what's going on with all this information that Elon Musk is drawing out of the federal government. What is he doing with it? We have no idea. There's no investigation of this. We demand answers, and we think our friends on the other side should demand answers of this also. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we've had a good, robust debate on the importance of the right tools for the Treasury, for our states, for our law enforcement to root out illicit finance. But today, the Corporate Transparency Act, I think, has been exposed for what it is, which is a tremendous overreach in that effort that's added complexity, financial burden, and confusion for our small businesses. There is a better way to go about this, and I hope that we can work together on both sides of the aisle with the Treasury Department in the coming months to find that better solution, that least costly solution, that solution that protects people's privacy, protects personally identifiable information contained in these filings, that does it in a way that's less intrusive and less costly. And the concern I have about these big databases, Mr. Speaker, is intrusion from China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, our adversaries that every day are trying to break into the systems of the federal government and our private sector in this country to gather this personally identifiable information. And we've talked about it on this House floor, Mr. Speaker. IRS, hacked. Office of Personnel Management, hacked. The CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau databases, hacked. Others hacked. Private sector hacked. This is just another giant database that puts people's data at risk. So not only do I think there's a better way to do it, a least costly way to do it, a more effective way to do it, but also protect people's privacy. So I thank Mr. Nunn for working on both sides of the aisle to craft a way. Let's take a new look, and let's do that by approving this bill overwhelmingly, encouraging the Senate to do the same so that we protect these small businesses in the interim over the next year from this horrendous cost and confusion by rising in strong support today on both sides of the aisle and passing H.R. 736. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 736? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection. The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, let's see. Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 975, the Credit Union Board Modernization Act.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 975, a bill to amend the Federal Credit Union Act to modify the frequency of Board of Directors meetings and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in strong support of H.R. 975, the Credit Union Board Modernization Act. I applaud my Financial Services Committee colleagues, Representatives Vargas and Huizenga, for introducing it. This bipartisan bill will help focus credit unions' time and resources where it really matters, serving their members. Federal credit unions are governed by boards of directors who are currently required by law, Mr. Speaker, to meet at least once a month. This outdated requirement prevents credit unions from attracting talented volunteers and professionals to a credit union's board due to the time commitment of a monthly board meeting. Under H.R. 975, certain well-functioning credit unions are provided with the option to meet at least 6 times annually, with at least one meeting held during each fiscal quarter of the year. This crucial change frees up the time and resources used for meetings to put toward critical mission of providing financial services to their credit union members. Importantly, this bill has guardrails to ensure the safety and soundness of our financial system. Only credit unions with a CAMELS composite rating of a 1 or 2 will be permitted to meet at this less frequent rate. All credit unions, just like commercial banks, are subject to a supervisory rating scale. It's called the CAMELS rating. A credit union is assessed in each of the 6 categories under that acronym, and they're assigned a composite rating on a scale from 1, the best, to 5, worst, based on capital adequacy, asset quality, management, earnings, liquidity, and sensitivity to market risk, hence the acronym CAMELS. Therefore, this bill provides an incentive to achieve the strongest supervisory rating so that a credit union might access the flexibility offered by this bill. Furthermore, by reducing the mandated number of board meetings for federally chartered credit unions, this legislation would promote parity between federal and state chartered credit unions, as 17 states currently allow for less frequent than monthly meetings. As I say, fewer mandated board meetings are especially helpful for rural credit unions who struggle to attract talent to their boards and already operate with significant regulatory burden and sometimes long travel. Of course, nothing in this legislation prevents credit union boards from meeting more frequently if they determine that's necessary. Credit unions play an essential role in our communities across this country, and H.R. 975 will ensure that they're able to operate more efficiently. I thank the gentleman from California's 52nd District, Mr. Vargas, for introducing this important bipartisan bill. I encourage all of our colleagues to support it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would also like to thank Chairman Hill and Ranking Member Waters for their support throughout this process. I rise in support of H.R. 975, the Credit Union Board Modernization Act. Credit unions are a vital part of our country's economic stability and success. These not-for-profit, member-owned institutions serve over 140 million Americans. Yet, for over 40 years, volunteer-led federal credit union boards have been burdened by an unnecessary requirement on meeting frequency. This bill gives financially sound and well-managed federal credit unions the flexibility they deserve. It will adjust the board meeting requirement by allowing qualifying federal credit unions to move from the current monthly meeting to meeting a minimum of 6 times annually with at least one meeting each fiscal quarter. This is a common sense fix that allows federal credit unions with a proven record of stability to dedicate more time and resources to the local communities they serve, like in San Diego, my hometown, and across the country. This fix also makes it easier for more Americans who currently are not able to serve on these boards due to the time commitment to have an opportunity to bring their perspectives to the table. And this bill contains key safeguards to ensure stability and mitigate risk. Newly formed credit unions and those with poor ratings, as Mr. Hill stated, will still be held to the current monthly meeting requirements. Under this bill, only federal credit unions with strong ratings from our federal regulators and proven management capacities and capabilities will be eligible for the new meeting requirements. This reasonable bipartisan bill passed the House twice, in both the 117th and 118th Congress. Again, I would like to thank my colleague, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, for working with me on advancing this legislation and his deep knowledge of the issues. Actually, a pleasure working with him again. And I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kemp.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hill. Thank you for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 975, the Credit Union Board Modernization Act. I also wanted to stand up and also echo and reiterate the points that are already addressed because this legislation is so important. And this bill would amend the Federal Credit Union Act to revise the frequency of the board meetings a federally chartered credit union must hold. Under current law, credit union boards must meet once per month. But this bill, H.R. 975, would allow credit unions to lower that threshold of required meetings to 6 per year. This bipartisan bill is needed to increase flexibility and unlock more resources for credit unions to better serve their members and our communities. Additionally, H.R. 975 creates an incentive for credit unions to improve their management ratings by decreasing the number of board meetings for those that have the best management ratings. On the other hand, credit unions that are poorly managed or are new federal credit unions will still be required to meet on a monthly basis. I commend my colleagues, Representatives Huizinga and Mr. Vargas, for reintroducing this common sense piece of legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 975 and eliminate burdensome regulations to let credit unions do what they best, which is to service their communities. As you heard, this has been passed in the 117th and 118th Congress. I think it's time to bring this home, and let's get this done this Congress. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we don't have any more speakers, so I yield to my friend, Mr. Vargas, if he wants to close, and I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm prepared then to close.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Credit unions are vital to our economy, to our communities. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and the consumers and small businesses that they serve. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge all my colleagues to support H.R. 975. I appreciate Mr. Vargas in sponsoring this good bill, Ms. Kim speaking on it. They represent the state of California, and the state of California has some of the nation's largest federal credit unions active and headquartered in their state. This will be a great service to those credit unions, particularly in the home state of California, to be able to focus on their members and have a few less meetings. So I thank the gentleman from California for his sponsorship. I urge a yes vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 975? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 965, the Housing Unhoused Disabled Veterans Act.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 965, a bill to amend Section 3B4 of the United States Housing Act of 1937 to exclude certain disability benefits from income for the purposes of determining eligibility for the supported housing program under Section 8019 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this bill.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise today in strong support of H.R. 965, the Housing Unhoused Disabled Veterans Act, introduced by my colleague on the Financial Services Committee, Congressman Brad Sherman of California. Much like the bill that we just considered a few minutes ago from our friend Ms. De La Cruz of Texas, I want to start out commending our colleague from California for his work on this related issue that once again speaks to the fairness in HUD programs on behalf of our nation's veterans. The Housing and Urban Development Veterans Affairs Support Housing, or a HUD-VASH program, was created back in 1992. The purpose? To assist homeless veterans with psychiatric and substance abuse disorders. The VASH program is an important federal tool that provides housing assistance and supportive services for low-income veterans experiencing homelessness. Of course, it might seem redundant to some that a program to help homeless veterans would be geared towards those who are low income. But sometimes with HUD, nothing is ever simple. Much like how HUD treats service-connected disability compensation of veterans as income in its CDBG program, HUD here treats any disability benefits a veteran receives under Chapter 11 or Chapter 15 of Title 38 of the U.S. Code as income under HUD-VASH. The predictable result? Some disabled homeless veterans are blocked from using a program to help all homeless veterans because HUD has decided that those low-income veterans that are disabled are too wealthy to qualify. Sound familiar? This is exactly the debate we had a few minutes ago. Someone always has to explain these government bureaucratic messes to me because they never make any common sense, Mr. Speaker. The reform we're talking about today, offered by Mr. Sherman, fixes this problem. It reforms the HUD income calculation used in the HUD-VASH program to ensure that the disability payments of a low-income veteran do not exclude them from accessing this housing support. The bill goes on to say that HUD needs to adopt the same income calculation standard for any future veteran housing program it might create using HUD-owned property. I applaud my colleague for calling attention to this problem and for his bipartisan work to find a solution. While this may seem like an easy fix, this is Washington. There are no easy fixes, and HUD has consistently placed bureaucratic obstacles in the way of program efficiency time and time again. In fact, when Representative Sherman brought this up last year to the Secretary of HUD, he got the same answer that Representative De La Cruz got on her veterans' CDBG income question. Hey, that's Congress's job to fix it, not HUD's. So fix it, indeed we will. The approach the gentleman has taken in crafting this bill is a good one that will make a big difference in the HUD-VASH program, as well as how about making a difference for the veterans who are eligible to use it? That's why we're on this House floor. I thank him for his hard work to honor the promises that we've made to our veterans and urge bipartisan support of this bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 965, the Housing Unhoused Disabled Veterans Act, sponsored by Representative Sherman. I thank Mr. Sherman for his work on this bipartisan bill, which will ensure homeless veterans, including those who may have higher incomes due to their disability benefits, they can access supportive housing through HUD-VASH program. However, an important distinction in this bill will expand access to housing for more disabled veterans who are experiencing homelessness while preserving limited rental assistance for those with the lowest incomes. I also want to take this opportunity to talk about the importance of preserving HUD-VASH. program as the Trump administration threatens to trample on Congress's constitutional powers of the purse by freezing federal funds that have already been designed and designated for the American people. HUD-VASH is arguably the most successful federal homeless program to date. In fact, under the Biden administration, Democrats were successful in lowering veteran homelessness to its lowest level ever on record, ever. That's what we can get done when we prioritize housing for people, not profit. HUD-VASH is the only federal program that is built to end veteran homelessness through the housing first approach, which Republicans have time and time again tried to discredit. Housing first works because it solves the root of the homelessness crisis, which is a lack of affordable housing. Specifically, the program ensures people who are experiencing homelessness can first get off the street and into stable housing, where they then are supported with wraparound services such as case management, job training, healthcare services, and more. If Housing First works to help end veteran homelessness, it can work for everyone else too. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill and look forward to a more bipartisan effort to scale up proven Housing First solutions to end homelessness nationwide. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Mr. Speaker, I want to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. De La Cruz, who's done so much to advance these reforms in HUD in our committee. We're grateful for her leadership. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you to my colleague for yielding. I rise today in support of H.R. 965, the Bipartisan Housing Unhoused Disabled Veterans Act, which I am proud to co-lead. Our veterans, particularly disabled veterans, have sacrificed immensely for our nation. Unfortunately, when they return home, they are met with unnecessary bureaucracy and government overregulation. Though we can never repay them for their sacrifice, we can show gratitude by ensuring that the bureaucratic obstacles do not stand in the way of veterans receiving the support that they need. H.R. 965 will make certain that disability benefits received by a veteran are not counted against a veteran seeking housing assistance under the HUD-VASH program. These programs are intended to help veterans, so let us ensure that we do all we can to ensure they achieve that mission by enacting common sense measures. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan solution to ensure those that sacrifice so much for this great country are not penalized for benefits they have earned through their selfless service. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I tell my good friend on the other side of the aisle that we have no more speakers, and I'm prepared to close, but I've reserved my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized. Or California is recognized. I'm sorry. I said it too many times.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do love Arkansas, but I do represent California. Although I do have to say the two people that worked on my staff did retire to Arkansas. That's where they're from originally, and they're enjoying themselves there. Well-managed state, I'm sure. And with that, I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who is also the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets and is the sponsor of this bill.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I thank the gentlelady from Texas. These are two companion bills. It has been good working with her. And my hope is that we not only pass both these bills today unanimously, but that we actually get the Senate to act. There's nothing more shameful than a homeless, disabled American veteran, one who's lost a limb defending us and now living on the streets. There are two programs to focus on that are designed to provide housing for the unhoused. The De La Cruz bill, which I was proud to be the chief Democratic advocate of, dealt with the CDBG program. This bill deals with a joint program between HUD and the Veterans Administration, HUD and the VA, and that's why the bill's title spells out HUD VA. The issue, again, is how do we define income for eligibility for housing? And certainly, we should change that definition when it applies to veterans housing for veterans on veterans' land. The worst thing we could do is exclude disabled veterans. This is particularly true because perhaps the most significant parcel that this will affect is in my district, and it is the largest VA hospital in the West. What better place for disabled American veterans to live when they need often hospital care than to live right there at the hospital? This bill amends the HUD definition of annual income to exclude disability payments received by a veteran for eligibility purposes for housing under the HUD VA supportive housing program. Last year, HUD did, in a major victory for us, decide.
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Markowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Resch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Britt, Collins, Fisher, Justice, Lummis, Marshall, Moody, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Tuberville. Mr. Curtis, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Gallego, Hassan, Heinrich, Kane, Kim, Merkley, Murphy, Padilla, Shaheen, Van Hollen, Warner, Whitehouse, Wyden. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Husted, aye. Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Also Brooks, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Ms. Ernst? Ms. Ernst? Aye. Mr. Sheehy? Mr. Sheehy? Aye. Mr. Moreno? Mr. Moreno? Aye. Mr. Crapo? Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? Aye. Mr. Ricketts? Mr. Ricketts? Aye. Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Ossoff? No. Ms. Hirono? No. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. McCormick? Mr. McCormick? Aye. Mr. Budd? Mr. Budd? Aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Rosen, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Hawley, Mr. Hawley, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Ms. Slotkin, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Coons, Mr. Coons. No. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, no.
The yeas are 52, the nays are 46. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President,
Senator from Colorado.
are we in a quorum call, Mr. President?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm grateful to be on the floor here tonight with my colleague from California, Senator Schiff, and others to talk about the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard, now the successful confirmation, I guess, of Tulsi Gabbard to be the Director of National Intelligence. To say the least, I never thought that we would see a moment in the history of the United States, the history of our attempt as a Congress to ensure that the American people and that the President gets the intelligence they need. In all these years, over all these decades, I never imagined we'd see somebody like Tulsi Gabbard approved on the floor of the United States Senate for that job. And I wanted to speak tonight just briefly to say why I think that was the wrong direction for the Trump administration, more importantly the wrong direction for the American people. Let me say, first of all, intelligence, and being a member of the Intelligence Committee, I know this is unlike anything else we do around here. Because a lot of what happens, my colleague Senator King from Maine is here, a lot of what happens is done in secret. And one of the great privileges of being on the Intelligence Committee is that, I think in part because it's in secret, there isn't the kind of partisanship that you see in a lot of the other committees. There isn't the jockeying for position or for political notoriety. The people on that committee are very, very serious about our work, and in part it's because we all have a responsibility on behalf of all the senators that are not on the committee to be able to transmit as well as we can the intelligence needs of our country, the intelligence findings of the intelligence community, and to play a very important role in oversight. Because if we didn't provide that role, the intelligence agencies could run amok without the American people ever knowing about it, or their representatives knowing about it. In fact, the whole reason we have the Intelligence Committee in the Senate is because so many terrible decisions were made by the intelligence agencies in the post-war period in the 1950s and 1960s. Some of it well-intentioned, during the Cold War, but a lot of it really bad judgments. It included things like the attempt to assassinate foreign leaders and to plot revolutions around the globe. And this Congress, this Senate, decided that we needed to have oversight for the American people. And we created the Intelligence Committee to do that. And it means that we have an institutional structure that ensures that the American people get the best service out of the intelligence community and that the President gets the best intelligence. And that structure was put in place by people who thought it was important for intelligence agencies not to run amok and for the President to get the best intelligence possible. And now we're putting somebody in the job of director of all the intelligence agencies, in a sense, the ODNI so-called, who's kind of the clearinghouse and the coordinator for all the intel that the president gets, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. Now look, she's had a record of public service in the Congress and in the military, and I don't dispute that. And I'm not calling into question whether or not she's serving the interests of other countries. But I do want to say, and I will be brief, Mr. President, that I think her judgment has been extraordinarily, I would say, exceptionally bad. I share her view that there were profound intelligence errors in the lead up to the Gulf War and the lead up to the war in Afghanistan. In the Gulf in particular, we remember, the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was supposed to have. Didn't have it. Terrible, terrible failure of our intelligence committee, terrible failure of oversight from this Congress. And she's right about that. The problem is she's, I think, learned the wrong lesson from that. And over and over and over again, when she has the opportunity to support the interests of the United States, I hate to say it, versus those of our adversaries, time and time again, she picks our adversaries. Or even our allies. I've heard her say how worried she is about what she describes as the remilitarization of Japan, which of course Japan is doing because of the threat from China, with our very, very close cooperation. That's of concern to Tulsi Gabbard. She went to Syria and famously came back disputing our own intelligence agencies' findings about Assad's gassing of his own people. To this day, she hasn't really taken that back, and it makes no sense at all. But the thing that drives me the craziest, Mr. President, is that she has been an apologist for what Vladimir Putin has done since the day Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Ukraine was a peaceful country with a peaceful border, and Vladimir Putin was the first tyrant since World War II ended. And we set up all of these multilateral institutions across Europe and across the world to prevent the kind of hostility that we had seen break out in World War II. And Vladimir Putin decided he would invade a peaceful country next door to him. And in his mind, he had a right to do that because Ukraine has been viewed by czars going back hundreds and hundreds of years as Russian territory. That is not the way the Ukrainian people look at this. They think of themselves as an independent country. They think of themselves as living in a place where history actually has moved on over the last 500 years or 1,000 years. And they were sitting there peacefully when Vladimir Putin invaded them with no provocation at all. And on the evening that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, Tulsi Gabbard tweeted out at 11:30 at night, her local time, this war, referring to the war, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, this war and suffering could easily have been avoided if the Biden administration, NATO, had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns regarding Ukraine's becoming a member of NATO, which would mean U.S. NATO forces right on Russia's border. Now, she gets mad when people read that stuff. That's what she said. And she says, well, don't tell people that I'm carrying propaganda for the Russian government or for Putin. That's not fair. I don't have to say that. But the Russian television put on TV in the days after the aftermath of Putin's invasion the very thing that Congressman Gabbard had said about his invasion, because they saw it as something that ratified what they had done. And it was so consistent, so aligned with his position, continues to be his position today, that he thought it would muddy the waters with people around the world about what they were doing in Ukraine. I believe Ukraine's battle from the very beginning has not been a battle for Ukraine. I think it's a battle for democracy. I think they are on the tip of the spear, in a way that nobody has been since World War II, and the Ukrainian people have been unbelievable. The Ukrainian soldiers have fought magnificently. There was a view when Putin invaded Ukraine, Mr. President, that in 3 days they were going to be in Kyiv, the Russians. And because of the bravery of the Ukrainian people, because of the bravery of the soldiers, many of whom have given up their lives, they have succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of anybody on this floor, of any of the Monday morning quarterbacking that's happened in this capital and other capitals around the world. And our allies all around Europe, but also in the Pacific area as well, all have seen what the Ukrainian people have accomplished. And when she had an opportunity to say something about the Ukrainians, when she had the opportunity to stand with the United States and stand with our allies, she made another choice. She's entitled to that choice. She's entitled to that choice, just as she's entitled to her views about the intelligence failures during the Gulf War. But the fact that she has the idiosyncratic views that she has, whether it's Putin's invasion of Ukraine or her writing a bill in the House to give Edward Snowden a pardon, that doesn't qualify her to be the lead intelligence official for the United States of America. As I said, and I'll finish here, Mr. President, we work well in a bipartisan way on these issues. The American people need the president to get intelligence in a way that's trustworthy, that is not shaded in one direction or another, and we all need to be able to trust each other in the delivery of that intelligence. And I will say that I think the president, in nominating Congresswoman Gabbard for this position, has fallen short. I voted for the CIA director. This is not an issue of his appointments to the intelligence agencies, but in the case of Congresswoman Gabbard, I think he missed the mark. And I apologize to my colleague from California for going on for so long. I will yield the floor to him.
Mr. President.
Senator from California.
After Tulsi Gabbard was selected as Donald Trump's nominee for Director of National Intelligence, the Russian newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda was overjoyed. They wrote, "The CIA and FBI are trembling." Sadly, the Russian newspaper is probably right about that. Another Russian state outlet called her a comrade. On a separate broadcast, top Putin mouthpiece Vladimir Solovyov, after gushing about Kash Patel, said, "And what about our girl? We have our girl there." Our girl is evidently the Kremlin's way of referring to our nominee, Tulsi Gabbard. His guest asked so as to be sure, intelligence? The answer was yes. RT, yet another Russian outlet that Ms. Gabbard regularly read and shared articles from, took to Twitter to defend her. Quote, "We've got your back, Tulsi." Yes, they certainly do. In September, it was revealed that RT was acting covertly on behalf of Moscow to spread propaganda in the United States. Not a surprise that RT has Tulsi Gabbard's back. The question is, should we? The Director of National Intelligence is the nerve center of our nation's intelligence network. It is the linchpin between 18 agencies tasked with detecting and preventing threats to our national security and coordinating our intelligence resources. It's a job that requires judgment. It requires experience. It requires a high degree of trust. Above all, it requires a deep and unwavering commitment to the truth and a willingness to stand up to despots. And yet the nominee before us is stunningly lacking in all of these qualities. Ms. Gabbard's record in Congress is not one of distinction in intelligence matters. She did not serve on the Intelligence Committee in the House, was not known for advancing meaningful legislation on intelligence in this space. When she did sign on to legislation, it was to eliminate critically important intelligence programs, or it was to praise those who leaked classified information and did great damage to our nation, like Edward Snowden. She did not wrestle with the complexities of the intelligence gathering and analysis process. In fact, in the moments when her voice was heard on matters of foreign policy, it was in ways that should concern all of us. She has echoed, amplified, and at times outright defended the positions of autocrats and despots. When now deposed Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad gassed his own people, she cast doubt on the findings of our own intelligence agencies, cast doubt on them, just like the Russian propaganda outlets did. This after she engaged in her own form of freelance foreign policy, traveling to Syria to meet with Assad and get the full scoop on his government's narrative of that murderous crusade. On her return, she positively crowed about how lovely this dictator was. Quote, "He wants to be seen as someone who cares for his country." Well, maybe if he wanted to be seen as someone who cares for his country, he shouldn't have gassed his own people. He wants to be seen as someone who would not conduct these kind of atrocities, Tulsi Gabbard said, except that he did. He did commit these kinds of atrocities. When Vladimir Putin launched his brutal war against our ally Ukraine, she once again parroted Kremlin talking points about so-called provocations by NATO. She repeated Russia propaganda claims that the U.S. had set up secret bioweapons labs in Ukraine and argued that the U.S., not Russia, is responsible for Putin's nuclear brinksmanship. This is the nominee for our intelligence agencies, not the Kremlin's. This is our nominee, Tulsi Gabbard. This is who this president seeks to hand over the keys to our national security, to entrust her with the nation's most closely held secrets, to be the final voice in the room advising the president on intelligence, to be, in the plain words of the law, quote, the principal advisor to the president, to the National Security Council, and the Homeland Security Council for intelligence matters related to the national security. This, Tulsi Gabbard. This nomination is not just unwise, it is dangerous. Make no mistake, Ms. Gabbard is entitled to her own personal opinions. She can apologize for Assad or Putin or any other murderous dictator to her heart's content. But we're not considering Ms. Gabbard for some position in which her bizarre fondness for foreign despots is beside the point. She is not the nominee for Postmaster General. We're considering her for one of the most important jobs in our intelligence community. And for that, Tulsi Gabbard is a walking five-alarm fire and must be rejected, must be. There is a reason the Director of National Intelligence must have the confidence of both the intelligence professionals that oversee and the nonpartisan that they oversee in the national security establishment. Because the job requires accountability. It requires trust. It requires truthfulness. In 2015, Ms. Gabbard joined a congressional delegation trip to the Middle East, the kind that so many of us in this chamber have participated in. She visited a Turkish town near the Syrian border, where countless refugees were sheltering. Her guide took Ms. Gabbard to meet two Syrian girls aged just 9 and 4 years old, who had been badly burned in a bombing carried out by the Syrian dictator's warplanes. The children's parents had been killed in that attack. These brave, small children told their story to the then Congresswoman. Now, in this situation, I think any of us would have roughly the same response. Some form of sympathy, some form of empathy, some attempt to provide comfort to these children who saw their lives and their families destroyed in front of them. But Ms. Gabbard had a very different response. By the account of the guide who was with her, she looked at the children and said, "How do you know if it was Assad? What if it was ISIS?" I should note that ISIS, of course, has no air force. But of course, that wasn't really the point, was it? The point was perhaps best illustrated by her guide, who was with her to that day and who said that experience, those days with Ms. Gabbard, he said, quote, "It dawned on me that Tulsi wasn't misinformed or ignorant." He said he worried instead that she, quote, "had a worldview that was adversarial to the United States." Adversarial to the United States. Think about that. Adversarial to the United States. And consider whether this is the right person to be director of national intelligence. Where do we draw the line with Donald Trump? What level of unfitness in a nominee? What level of unconstitutionality in an executive action? What level of abject disregard of our judicial system? What national security threat or risk will it take? What action could he commit where we would be joined by our Republican colleagues in saying we've had enough? Where is the line? When is an action too egregious or an appointment too absurd, a risk or threat that is too big? Where is the line? Is it disobeying a lawful court order, which this administration seems to be laying the groundwork to do? Is it confirming a patently unqualified FBI director who wants to close down FBI headquarters and makes music with felons who beat law enforcement? Is it a director of HHS who doesn't believe in vaccines, or a director of national intelligence who has sought to undermine vital intelligence operations and whom the Russians and others viewed as aligned with them instead of with us? Where is the line? Because for me, that line has been crossed a long, long time ago. I will not support this nomination. And I urge my colleagues to think long and hard before they do. Because if Ms. Gabbard is confirmed, we will not need the luxury of hindsight. We already have the luxury of hindsight. The threats to our nation are real. Those who wish us harm are busy plotting against us. There are plots to conduct attacks on U.S. soil. There are intelligence warnings about China's intentions to replace U.S. influence around the world, and about Russia's relentless assaults against our friends and allies. And at a moment when the world is watching, when our allies and our adversaries are questioning America's stability and leadership on the global stage, we cannot afford to confirm a director of national intelligence who lacks the qualifications, the judgment, and the credibility to lead. We cannot. Remember that Russian broadcaster I mentioned earlier, Vladimir Solovyov. Here's some of the rest of that exchange with the guest on his show. "Well," he said, with Tulsi Gabbard, it's not that simple." The guest replied, "It might not work because what if it's not approved? The Russians are worried that Tulsi Gabbard might not be approved by this body." That should tell us something. People, please, do we need the Kremlin to spell it out for us, what they are hoping and if they prayed, would be praying for us to do? Solovyov seemingly answered that question for us live on Russian TV. Quote, "Why are you suddenly so doubtful?" he asked his guest. Solovyov seemed nervous about the chances for confirmation of the woman he described as our girl, Tulsi Gabbard. Perhaps he fears that Congress has more common sense than to confirm someone who prefers Russia's worldview over matters like Ukraine's sovereignty to our own national security professionals. But do we? Do we possess that basic common sense, for the sake of our country, for the sake of our nation's most sensitive classified information, and for the sake of the workforce that keeps us safe, I hope and pray that we do. That we possess the common sense to vote down Tulsi Gabbard. We will soon find out. And I yield back.
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate be in a period of morning business for debate only, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I understand the chair has an announcement for the Senate.
The chair announces, the presiding officer, the chair announces on behalf of the Committee on Finance pursuant to Section 8002 of Title 26, U.S. Code, the designation of the following senators as members of the Joint Committee on Taxation. The senator from Idaho, Mr. Crapo, the senator from Iowa, Mr. Grassley, the senator from Texas, Mr. Cornyn, the senator from Oregon, Mr. Wyden, the senator from Washington, Ms. Cantwell.
Mr. President, I understand that there's a bill at the desk that's due for a second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
H.R. 29, an act to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to take into custody aliens who have been charged in the United States with theft and for other purposes.
Mr. President, in order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding.
Objections having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, February 11th, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved today, at the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day. Morning business be closed, and the Senate proceed to executive session and resume executive calendar number 18, that at all time during morning business, recess, adjournment, and leader remarks count post-closure. Further, that the Senate recess from 12:30 p.m. until 2:15 p.m. to allow for the weekly conference meetings.
Without objection, so ordered.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of Senator Welch.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Donald Trump, as we all know, won the last election in November, and he's now the 47th President of the United States. But Donald Trump did not, contrary to what he and the Vice President want people to believe, win by anything close to a landslide. As this chart shows, out of a total of 155,238,302 votes, Mr. Trump won 77,302,000, or 49.8%. Kamala Harris won 75 million, or 48.3%. President Trump won, but just slightly over 2 million votes more than Kamala Harris. The difference between them was 1.5% of the popular vote. And although it was one of the smallest margins of victory in since the 19th century, President Trump, in his inaugural address, and others in the inner circle of Trump, repeatedly called the victory a landslide, a blowout, a mandate, historic. You know what a real landslide is? Lyndon Johnson in 1964 won by 22.6%. Ronald Reagan won by 18.2%. Those are landslides. But why does it matter? Because facts matter. The truth matters. And we cannot survive in our democracy without respect, and much more respect for the truth. It's also really important because when one goes, whether you're running for the U.S. Senate or the presidency of the United States, when one goes from candidate for office to the president or the U.S. senator in office, the responsibility that we have is to all the people in our district, and certainly for the president of the United States, a responsibility to all the people in the United States. We serve all, whether they voted for us or against us. But what has been happening with the assertion that this was this massive landslide is it has become a justification for narrow policies that completely disrespect the reality that so many other Americans need to be represented and heard, and also is so narrow that even among those who voted for President Trump for a variety of reasons are not getting policies they thought would be included. The America First policies so far have cut funding for programs to protect water that all Americans need, clean air that we all breathe, whether it is a voter who was for Trump or a voter who was for Harris. We are cutting funding for medical research for cancer, cures for kids who have cancer, for food assistance to the food malnourished kids and parents who are in every district in this country. And of course, most spectacularly, what we're seeing is the illegal termination of the USAID program, something the courts have rescinded, but the administration is rushing pell-mell nevertheless. All of this actually is in service of being able to find offsets in order to pay for the Trump tax cuts that are heavily weighted to folks who are billionaires like Mr. Musk, and of course to our major U.S. corporations. And you know what? The folks who need a tax cut are the everyday Americans who have been trying to make ends meet and are having real trouble doing that. The White House is not even trying to hide what they're doing. You've got Elon Musk. You know, it's pretty astonishing. He owns Twitter, which is a source of immense misinformation. He now is trying to buy ChatGPT. He has massive amounts of government contracts for Starlink and for space and for his space program. And he has contributed $280 million to the Trump campaign. And now, without any elected authority, without any advice and consent to the Senate on a position that is very powerful, the so-called DOGE administrator, he has access to the private information of millions of Americans, all that confidential information about your Social Security and mine that's in the Treasury Department. So how is that happening? That is not in service of the folks who didn't vote for Mr. Trump. It's not even in service of the folks, of people who did. But you know, it's important that elections be, and the outcomes of elections be respected. You know, this last election, just like in 2020, the people who oversaw this election worked hard to ensure that it was free and fair. We don't all get the outcome that we want, but it was free and fair. The difference in this election is that we, on the losing side, accepted the result. We didn't falsely claim that it was stolen, the Stop the Steal narrative, as President Trump continues to assert about 2020, and most of his cabinet nominees do as well. We didn't try to prevent the outcome from being certified or to promote an insurrection by a violent mob, folks who actually attacked, injured people in this building and police officers, spit in their face, hit them with poles, and we had police officers who died after that attack. Falsely denying the outcome of an election and then using violence to overturn the result of a free and fair election absolutely subverts the democratic process. And as every American voter knows, free and fair elections, like the checks and balances between our three co-equal branches of government, are absolutely essential to the well-being and continuation of our democracy. You know, in the inaugural address that the president gave, I did not hear anything about child care or the cost of housing or bringing down the cost of prescription drugs and making health care more affordable. Things that everyday families in every single part of this country need help with, to be able to pay those bills at the end of the month have their checkbook still balanced. If and when the president starts focusing on those issues, I and my colleagues are absolutely ready to work with him and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, because those things, affordable broadband, affordable health care, affordable housing and rent, some economic security, those are things every single one of us needs. And the challenges that we face, whether it's Red America or Blue America, to try to have better policies to make that happen, are things that we must be working on together, but not where what comes first, last, and always are these tax cuts that explode the deficit and go to folks who are not now paying their fair share. So as long as President Trump and his allies pretend that he has this massive mandate to literally disrupt and throw out the traditions and norms and guardrails of democracy, that is something I and so many of my colleagues will resist. We can't do that. The law matters. Respect for your opponents matters. And focusing on the everyday needs of everyday people is what matters most. It's what is the goal all of us should be looking to accomplish. So, Mr. President, there was no mandate, no massive mandate. There was a victory. But with victory, to describe it as this smashing mandate is a suggestion that what awaits us and has already arrived is overreach and failure. Mr. President, I yield back.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Thanks. No, I'm good. Thank you. Thanks a lot.